There are criminal acts so strange they don't seem born of this world. Acts that feel less like premeditation and more like contagion, as if madness itself could pass between two minds. Throughout history, a rare and haunting disorder, known as folie à deux, the madness of two, has surfaced in the lives of twins and inseparable pairs whose bond grows so complete it eclipses reality. What begins as shared empathy becomes mirrored paranoia, delusion passed like breath, until reason erodes and the world turns hostile. In 2008, the Eriksson Twins hurled themselves into oncoming traffic, convinced unseen forces were hunting them. Before them, in the 1980s, June and Jennifer Gibbons retreated into silence so absolute that one had to die for the other to speak again. And even further back, in 1933, Christine and Leah Papin descended from their attic room to slaughter the family they served, their fury indistinguishable from devotion. For the evidence room, this is the story of those three sets of twins, and the tragic consequences of their shared psychosis that's befuddled doctors and researchers alike for decades. This is the story of folie à deux. The Eriksson twins seemed, at first glance, utterly ordinary. Two middle-aged sisters from Sweden, visiting family, leading quiet lives in separate countries. But what unfolded across a single weekend in May 2008 would defy all logic and ignite one of the strangest and most disturbing cases ever captured on British television. Sabina and Ursula Eriksson's descent into shared psychosis began with a ferry crossing and ended with one of them killing a man who had offered nothing but kindness. What happened in between, their unprovoked sprint into motorway traffic, their unbreakable bond, their identical paranoia, left investigators and psychiatrists grasping for answers. It began quietly enough. Ursula had flown from the United States to visit her sister in Ireland, but within 24 hours of arriving, something had shifted. After an unexplained argument in Sabina's home, the sisters vanished without a word, abandoning Sabina's children and leaving behind no note, no plan, no reason. The next morning, they were seen in Liverpool, clutching their bags like their lives depended on it, muttering about danger and theft. When they boarded a coach bound for London, their behavior grew erratic, whispering about pursuers, refusing to part with their luggage, and alarming the driver so much that he ejected them at a motorway rest stop. Police briefly intervened, but finding no drugs or weapons or signs of violence, they let the sisters go. Minutes later, they walked straight into the chaos of the M6 motorway. What followed was captured in real time by a BBC film crew. The twins darting into traffic, Sabina struck by a car, Ursula's legs crushed under a lorry, and both screaming of their imagined threats. "They're going to steal your organs," Sabina shouted, resisting paramedics, before leaping back into oncoming vehicles. Neither woman was drunk, neither woman was high, or delusional in the conventional sense, but both seemed trapped inside the same unraveling delusion. When the dust settled, Sabina was walking, talking, and calm, as if the hysteria had drained from her completely. Ursula lay hospitalized with broken legs. Sabina, after only a few hours in custody, was released back into the world. The court saw her as disoriented but harmless, sentencing her to a single day for assault and motorway trespass. No one ordered a psychiatric evaluation. No one realized what would happen next. Just hours after walking free from police custody, Sabina Eriksson wandered the streets of Stoke-on-Trent, alone, disoriented, and still clutching her few belongings in a clear plastic police bag. She wore her sister's green top, asked strangers where the nearest hospital was, and spoke as if she was being followed. By evening, she crossed paths with two locals, Glenn Hollenshed and his friend Peter Malloy, who were out walking Glenn's dog. Glenn was a kind-hearted man, an ex-RAF airman and trained paramedic, known for helping anyone in need. When Sabina mentioned she had nowhere to stay, he offered her a place to rest for the night. At first, nothing seemed amiss. They shared a few drinks at Glenn's home on Duke Street, but Sabina's erratic behavior soon unsettled both men. She paced the room, peered nervously out the windows, and whispered about danger. She offered them cigarettes, only to snatch them back seconds later, insisting they might be poisoned. Malloy quietly excused himself near midnight, uneasy but unaware of how quickly the evening would turn tragic. The next day, Glenn tried to help her again. He phoned hospitals to locate Ursula and borrowed tea bags from a neighbor. Moments later, he stumbled back into the street, bleeding, gasping for air, and told his neighbor, "She stabbed me." He collapsed and died within minutes, having suffered 5 stab wounds to his chest and head. There was no sign of struggle, no motive, no robbery, just a sudden, senseless act of violence from a woman who seemed lost inside her own mind. Glenn's final words were heartbreakingly ordinary. Quote, "Look after my dog for me," end quote. What followed was a scene of utter chaos. Sabina fled the house barefoot, clutching a hammer and striking herself repeatedly in the head. When a passerby, 54-year-old Joshua Gradage, tried to intervene, she lashed out, hurling a roof tile at his face. Police and paramedics chased her through the streets as she screamed incoherently. Reaching Heron Cross, Sabina climbed a bridge railing and jumped nearly 40 feet onto the A50 below, shattering both ankles and fracturing her skull. Even then, she miraculously survived, alive but broken, the full extent of her psychosis only beginning to surface. When Sabina Eriksson was finally arrested in June 2008, she was still recovering from her shattered ankles and fractured skull. But by the time she stood trial the following year, she appeared calm, coherent, and almost detached, as if the chaos that had consumed her life had belonged to someone else entirely. Formally charged with the manslaughter of Glenn Hollenshed, Sabina entered a plea of guilty under diminished responsibility. The prosecution and defense were in rare agreement. Whatever had taken hold of her on that motorway and in Glenn's home was not a rational state of mind. The judge, Justice Saunders, called her actions, quote, "beyond comprehension," yet acknowledged that she had been insane at the time, sentencing her to just 5 years in prison. 5 years for a killing that had left another family permanently shattered. Psychiatrists diagnosed Sabina with folie deux, a shared psychosis that can arise between two closely bonded individuals, particularly twins. Ursula was believed to be the primary sufferer, with Sabina absorbing and echoing her delusions. The sisters' behavior aligned perfectly with the disorder's hallmarks: synchronized paranoia, disorganized thought, auditory hallucinations, and sudden, almost miraculous returns to lucidity. They had acted as a single divided mind, mirroring one another in movement, speech, and fear. And when they were finally separated, Sabina's break from reality spiraled violently inward, culminating in the death of a man who had only tried to help her. The case sparked widespread outrage, not only for the violence itself, but for the system's failure to recognize clear psychosis when it unfolded in real time. Officers on the motorway footage, later broadcasted by the BBC, were heard debating whether to detain the twins under the Mental Health Act. Yet, no such intervention took place. Instead, Sabina was released back into the public just 5 hours after trying to run into live traffic, showing every sign of delusional thought. To many, that meant Glenn's death was preventable, a consequence of institutional indifference. His brother Gary would later say, quote, "Her mental condition should have been properly assessed after what she did on the motorway. Glenn saw Eriksson in distress and was just trying to help. It was in his nature." End quote. In the years since, both sisters have vanished from public life. Sabina reportedly turned to religion during her imprisonment. Ursula quietly returned to the United States. But the footage of their motorway madness endures online, a haunting record of shared delusion, systemic negligence, and the fragility of the human mind. Fear becomes contagious. The Eriksson case remains one of Britain's most disturbing modern parables, not just a tragedy of two sisters, but of a system that watched madness unfold in plain sight, simply let it walk away. Unfortunately, they aren't the only ones to have suffered this fate. June and Jennifer Gibbons were born together, lived together, and for nearly 3 decades, seemed to exist only through each other. Their story begins in Yemen, where their father was stationed with the Royal Air Force, but it unfolded in the quiet rural isolation of Haverfordwest, Wales, an environment that would amplify every shadow of their psychological bond. As the only black family in their community, the Gibbons children endured constant racism and exclusion, but the twins, June and Jennifer, bore the brunt of it. They withdrew entirely from the outside world, choosing silence as both shield and language. By adolescence, they spoke only to one another in a rapid, indecipherable dialect that blended English with Bajan Creole. To everyone else, they were mute, but to each other, they were an entire world. Teachers, social workers, and doctors all failed to reach them. When authorities tried to separate the twins in hopes of breaking their dependence, the result was near catastrophic. Both descended into a state of catatonia, refusing food, movement, or speech. Their personalities had fused so completely that neither could function in isolation. When reunited, they were more inseparable than ever, moving in perfect unison, walking in step, mirroring each gesture like a reflection brought to life. The outside world began to see them as strange, even dangerous. But inside their locked bedroom, they were prolific, filling hundreds of notebooks with fiction, poetry, and intricate tales of violent sex and celebrity obsession. Their imagination became their rebellion. They invented characters who lived the lives they could not, beautiful delinquents in Malibu, charismatic murderers, doomed lovers. But as their creative world expanded, their reality crumbled. When their self-published novels went unnoticed, the sisters turned outward, their fixation on transgression spilling into real life. They began committing small crimes: shoplifting, vandalism, petty theft. Each act an escalation of defiance. It culminated in arson, the burning of a Pembrokeshire tractor showroom, a crime that finally drew the attention of the courts and a psychiatric establishment. In 1981, June and Jennifer were sentenced not to prison, but to an indefinite detention at Broadmoor Hospital, the same institution that once held some of Britain's most notorious offenders. They were just 18 years old at the time, and for the next 14 years, the twins lived behind the walls of a high-security psychiatric hospital, medicated and studied, their shared madness cataloged as one of the most extreme documented cases of, you guessed it, folie à deux. Inside Broadmoor Hospital, the twins' strange union only deepened. They were both diagnosed with psychosis, though the true nature of their illnesses defied clinical clarity. Doctors could never agree whether their madness was shared or symbiotic, one born from the other. But the results were undeniable. They moved as mirrors, thought as one, and descended together into something that resembled both devotion and imprisonment. Heavy doses of antipsychotic drugs dulled their minds and blurred their vision. Jennifer's face began to twist involuntarily from the side effects of tardive dyskinesia. Their sentence was technically indefinite under the Mental Health Act, which meant they were locked away for 11 years, far longer than most white adult offenders would have served for the same crimes. Broadmoor, with its iron gates and sterile corridors, became their entire world, and within it, the line between identity and delusion vanished. Nurses described them as eerie synchronized specters who seemed to exist under a single consciousness. Even when placed in different wings, they were seen assuming identical poses or moving in perfect rhythm. They even alternated eating habits, as if bound by an invisible pendulum, one starving, while the other consumed enough for two. Their diaries from this period exposed the psychological horror of their bond. Love and hatred braided into the same breath. June wrote of her sister as a dark shadow robbing me of a sunlight, while Jennifer confessed that they had become fatal enemies who could not live apart or together. Their writing captured what words like psychosis or madness could not. A portrait of codependency so total that it defied separation, even by reason or medicine. When journalist Marjorie Wallace began visiting them, she found two young women trapped in an invisible cage of their own design. Unlike the psychiatrists who viewed them as mere subjects, Wallace treated them as storytellers. Slowly, they opened to her. She became one of the only outsiders they ever trusted. Over time, she uncovered the secret that defined their relationship. The twins believed that one of them had to die for the other to live. It was a pact of tragedy that went beyond mere metaphor, and both accepted it as fate. In 1993, after 11 years in confinement, the Gibbons twins were approved for transfer to a lower security facility. During their final meeting, Jennifer looked at Wallace and said quietly, quote, "Marjorie, I'm going to have to die because we've decided," end quote. On the day of the transfer, as they rode together to Caswell Clinic, Jennifer rested her head on June's shoulder and simply stopped breathing. There was no struggle, no warning, no poison in her system. Her heart had simply failed, a diagnosis of acute myocarditis, though no clear cause was ever found. June later said it was as though Jennifer had willed herself to die. In the days that followed, June began speaking, fluently, openly, as if the silence that had bound them left with her twins' final breath. "I'm free at last," she said, "liberated, and at last Jennifer has given up her life for me." Jennifer was buried in Haverford West, and June quietly rebuilt a life nearby, speaking occasionally to journalists about the ordeal. Her tone was never triumphant, only resolute, as if she'd survived something beyond understanding. "We made a pact," she told one interviewer. "We said we weren't going to speak to anybody. We stopped talking altogether. Only us two, in our bedroom upstairs. For years, people have tried to explain what happened between June and Jennifer Gibbons. Psychosis, codependence, supernatural will. But perhaps the truth lies somewhere darker and more intimate. In a folie à deux bond so absolute that death became the only form of separation left. Christine and Leah Papin were shaped by violence right upon birth. Their childhoods unfolded in the shadows of abandonment and humiliation, scattered between relatives and institutions that treated them more like property than children. Their father, Gustav, was a heavy drinker, and their mother, Clemence, was known for her cold, vindictive temperament. Together, they built a home of resentment and neglect, a home that collapsed as quickly as it was built. By the time their parents divorced in 1913, the sisters had already been separated from one another, scattered to different caretakers, orphanages, and convents. None of them grew up with affection, and all of them grew up knowing punishment. The Papin sisters' formative years were spent at Bon Pasteur, a Catholic orphanage in Le Mans where silence and servitude were virtues. Discipline was absolute, and individuality was seen as defiance. It was here that Christine and Leah learned how to scrub, sew, cook, and obey. But most importantly, how to survive. Christine the elder possessed a fiery streak. She was bright, capable, and quick to question authority, though she knew better than to show it openly. Leah was the opposite, shy, submissive, easily led. Their personalities were opposite poles drawn to each other by trauma. What began as sisterly loyalty hardened into dependence. By adulthood, Christine and Leah were inseparable. They refused to work in separate households, and any employer who tried to split them quickly learned the cost of that mistake. In each new home, they brought precision and perfectionism. They worked quietly, diligently, but always together. When they were hired by the Lancelin family in 1926, it seemed at first to be a steady arrangement. The Lancelins, a well-off bourgeois family living at 6 Rue Bruyère in Le Mans, were respected and proper, everything the Papin sisters were not allowed to be. Léonie Lancelin was particular and demanding, and her daughter Genevieve mirrored her mother's temperament. Yet this arrangement lasted longer than anyone might have predicted. For nearly 7 years, Christine and Leah lived in the attic above the Lancelin home, descending each day to clean, polish, and serve. They worked long hours, rarely leaving the house, and had almost no social contact outside of each other. To the outside world, they were perfect servants, quiet, obedient, and efficient. Inside the house, though, the atmosphere was suffocating. The sisters existed in a world of isolation, silence, and shared thought. Christine took command of Leah's life entirely. Leah followed her sister's orders with absolute devotion. And it was in that claustrophobic attic that their codependency evolved into something far darker, a psychological entanglement that would one day explode into madness. What began as a lifetime of servitude and repression was now tightening like a vice. Years of humiliation and isolation had fused their minds into one. When the violence finally erupted inside the Lancelin household on that cold evening, February 1933, it would not be an act of spontaneous rage, but the breaking point of two minds that had become indistinguishable from each other. When police entered the Lancelin residence on that winter night in 1933, they stumbled into something that defied reason. A crime scene so grotesque that even seasoned officers recoiled. Upstairs in a locked room lit by candlelight, Christine and Leah Papin waited in silence, their employer's blood still fresh on the hammer beside them. Below, Madame Lancelin and her daughter lay mutilated beyond recognition, their eyes torn from their sockets, their bodies reduced to pulp. The violence was not impulsive. It was frenzied, ritualistic, a breaking point reached after years of repression and humiliation. For nearly 7 years, the Papin sisters had lived as shadows within the Lancelin household. They shared an existence defined by servitude. Madame Lancelin's obsessive standards left no room for error, and her daughter's indifference toward the maids only deepened the distance. Every day was a performance of submission, one that Christine led and Leia followed. When the iron blew a fuse that afternoon and the lights went out, it was just a small mistake. But in the world of their employer, small mistakes were sins. So when Madame returned home early and erupted in fury, something inside Christine cracked. What followed was a storm of violence that left both women dead within minutes. Witness accounts and later confessions suggested the sisters acted as one, Christine directing, Leia obeying, and their rage synchronized. By the time the blood dried, the sisters had retreated upstairs, bathed, and laid down together to wait for the police. It was not guilt that they felt, but a kind of eerie peace, as though their act had resolved something unspoken between them. Their arrest and trial became a national fixation. Intellectuals, psychologists, and philosophers all sought meaning in the madness. Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir called it a rebellion against class oppression. Others saw it as pure psychosis and an eruption of folie à deux. Christine's domination over Leia was absolute, and without her sister, Leia's mind collapsed inward. In prison, Christine's sanity disintegrated further. She starved herself, clawed at her own eyes, and died just 4 years later, emaciated and delirious. Leia somehow survived, serving her sentence quietly before finally vanishing into obscurity. The Papin murders exposed something France wasn't ready to confront. Not only the brutality of the act, but the social machinery that made it possible. 2 women, born into silence, molded by servitude, and confined to an attic that had turned that silence back on their oppressors. What the world saw as madness may have been, in their minds, the first and only act of freedom they ever knew. In every case of shared madness, there's a point where the line between love and annihilation disappears. The Eriksons called it destiny, the Gibbons saw it as sacrifice, and the Papins believed it was survival. But beneath each episode lies the same truth. Folie à deux thrives in isolation. It feeds on silence, on closeness that becomes confinement, until one voice is no longer distinct from the other. Society tends to dismiss these cases as curiosities or tragic footnotes of psychosis, and yet they expose something far more unsettling: the human need to belong so completely that, in the wrong conditions, it consumes the self. The horror of folie à deux is not that it turns 2 people mad, but that it binds them so tightly that sanity itself no longer feels like freedom. May the memories of those who fell victim to the violence of others be remembered, and may our understanding of psychiatric syndromes of similar violence grow, so that we may know how to better treat these patients from now until forever.